Thank you. I'm going to get started. I've got 2 hours today to crank out as much of this as I can for you. If I can't get through all the material, then I will make a part two, because this is an important topic and I want to make sure you get all the relevant information. I don't know how many of you attended the listings class last week. A lot of this is redundant to that, but since the purchase contract itself is so important, I'm going to shorten the portions that I cover, for example, on the agency disclosure and things like that, so we can make sure to get through most of the stuff on the purchase contract. Also, if you'll email me with your contact information after the class, I can email the actual version of this with all my highlights and notes and stuff on it, so you have it for your records. A lot of it are talking points for me, so I make sure to cover certain things, but some of them will help you also. So with that, let's get going. If you attended the listing agreement class, I explained to you that that is an actual contract. Well, this is also a contract. And all of, whether it's a listing, whether it's a purchase offer, they all start with a declaration of your agency agreement that you have with the client. So as before, we have an agency disclosure. That'll be the top of the package that you print out when you use zip forms. It'll be included in the contract already along with some other forms. The agency disclosure is meant to be given to your client first thing before you actually present them with the offer that they're going to sign. So basically, the agency disclosure is your declaration to the client as to who you are representing, what is a seller's agent, what is a buyer's agent, what is an agent that is representing both, which is also known as dual agency, and explain your duties and responsibilities. The key point that I want to present to you here is that whether you're a seller's agent or a buyer's agent, buyer's agent will be writing this offer, you both owe a fiduciary duty of utmost care, integrity, honesty, and loyalty in dealing with either the buyer or the seller. And it doesn't matter which side of it you're on. If you're representing the buyer, you still have that duty that you owe to the seller. If you're representing the seller, you have that duty that you owe to the buyer. That doesn't mean that you have to have, detailed conversations with them about your strategies and tactics for getting an offer accepted. But you have to deal fairly and honestly with them. You can't conceal facts. If you're representing the seller and you know that there's some material fact that is relevant to whether a buyer would want to purchase that property, you can't conceal that fact or help the seller conceal that fact. If you're representing both seller and buyer, that would be a case where you're either personally representing the seller or the buyer, or you could be in an office with 200 other agents, and you may not even know the listing agent. You've never met the listing agent, even though your license is hung under that same brokerage. But if he's representing a seller and you present an offer, again, you don't know that agent, you never met him, but you're within the same brokerage, that is dual agency. And that requires a dual agency disclosure to the client, whether it's the seller or the buyer. So I'll leave the agency disclosure with that. For your information, the second page of the agency disclosure has the civil code sections that describe what an agent is, what a buyer is, what a listing agreement means, what a seller means, and a few other things. Usually when I am describing this to a client and telling them about my duties or whatnot, I will just tell them the second page are the actual lawyer-written civil code sections if you're interested in reading. Second page is going to be your fair housing and discrimination advisory. This is extremely important as an agent, because if you get hung up in a fair housing violation, it can cost you your license and can cost you a lot of money in the long run. So best way to avoid this, and I will teach a separate class just on fair housing because there's that much information to it. But the way to avoid being caught up in a fair housing violation is simply treat everybody equally. It doesn't matter, you know, if one is African American, one is white, one is green, purple, red, yellow, it doesn't matter. You treat them all the same. If you're picking properties for them to look at as a buyer's agent, you are going to pick properties that meet the physical criteria of the home. They're interested in a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, single-story home, built 1995 or later on a cul-de-sac. Well, unless they give you a specific area to look in, you're going to look in any areas that have properties that fit that criteria.
Bruce, I
Yeah.
have a question right on that note.
One question, stand by.
I had a lot of people tell me like, well, like one buyer came to me and he's like, from the Bay Area, so he doesn't really know the area well. And he said, you know, I went to North Highlands and I don't like that area. So he said, I want areas that are not like that, but like North Natomas. So how do you deal with that when they're like, when they say not like North Natomas?
So basically what you need to
I mean,
do.
North Highlands, I mean, not
Yeah,
like.
so the question was, Bay Area client came out here, says to the agent, after looking at a property in North Highlands, this is this example, and he says, you know, I want properties that are in areas not like that. Well, at that point, if it were me, I would say, well, I don't, and I would say, I don't know what you mean by not like that. If you're referring to crime rates and things like that, I don't, you know, you can say, I don't look at crime rates. You're free to find those online. If you're looking for a newer community, I can find newer communities for you. But you need, you know, you need to tell me, do you want to be near I-5 and 8, or do you want to be off of the Highway 50 corridor? You know, give them some selections. Don't, whatever you do not try to, North Highlands is kind of a mixed bag it's very, I think it's a very eclectic area. It's an older working class neighborhood. You can find similar neighborhoods that are older working class in South Natomas. And you could say to them, are you looking for, a working class neighborhood, or are you looking for an area that has newer homes? And you can kind of redirect them from that question. But, the kiss of death sometimes is when a client says to you, I want an area where there's not a high crime rate, or I want an area where the schools are good. You want to stay away from those discussions. And what I would normally say is, look, I'm licensed by the state as a real estate broker, a real estate agent. Fair housing laws prohibit me from directing people to specific areas for those reasons. What I would suggest you do is there are sites online that can direct you to, quality of schools. You can check with the crime rates through the state. They have reporting things there. If you're concerned about, sex offenders in an area, whatever, you can check the Megan's Law database. You can do all sorts of research like that on your own. But in terms of housing, you tell me what kind of housing you're looking for. You tell me, whether you want new or old, what area you want, and I will be happy to find that for you. You just gotta use as much tact as you can to avoid getting into those subjects. And one of the reasons that's really important is because the Department of Housing and Urban Development and some of these other fair housing organizations, they will send what they call shoppers out. And they will try to get you to make mistakes like this that are really a fair housing violation. And you just want to avoid that. It's just not worth it. And if you think, personally, I won't get into those games with a client. And I would just redirect it somewhere else. And if they're not happy with that, then it's probably not meant to be. It's just you really need to refrain from getting involved in that discussion. In terms of fair housing, this is Fair Housing Week, by the way. So it's being celebrated nationally. But the main things that are protected, and there's different levels of protection because it involves federal laws, state laws, even county, down to county laws on who are considered a protected class. And the way to avoid this is just treat everybody as equal. It doesn't matter what their their sexual orientation is, doesn't matter their color. As long as their money is green and they are able to buy, you show them the houses that fit their criteria. Again, avoid, when they talk about, high crime areas and, whatnot, you don't wanna get involved in that because, imagine what would happen if you said, oh yeah, this is a low crime area. They move there and somebody, they get a home invasion robbery and somebody's hurt. Well, my agent said this is a low crime area. You just wanna avoid all that stuff.
Has there actually been a case where a realtor got punished or scrutinized because of a statement he said?
Oh, there have been many. It happens all the
How
time.
do they go back to the agent though without proof? Do they need proof?
Well, if they are the shopper,
Right.
they work for that organization or they're planted by that organization, they have it, they have the testimony because it was said to them.
So they only need a one-sided testimony?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I'm sure they record them, and mainly where you see stuff like that is in the property management field. People calling, to rent properties, and it's very easy to build a case of discrimination and other types of profiling against the property manager. So, that happens regularly.
Wow.
That's where you see it most.
Right.
But you never want to be directing people to a specific area based on their color or their orientation, anything like that. So I'm going to go through the rest of the fair housing stuff. The next page in the purchase offer is a possible representation of more than one buyer or seller disclosure and consent. I talked about this in the listing contract a little bit. This is a form that came about because of a lawsuit in Southern California. Basically, Coldwell Banker brokerage down there, they listed a property on the street. Short time later, the sign goes up. Another home on that street lists their property with another agent from that Coldwell Banker office, and a buyer is found through a Coldwell Banker agent, and that buyer decides to buy the house that was put on the market second instead of the house that was put on the market first, and the owner of the property that was listed first sues Coldwell Banker and claims that the agent was steering that buyer to their property. Well, what this form basically does is it talks about the fact that we deal with multiple buyers, multiple sellers. It also touches on dual agency and the agency relationship. But it also says that we don't tell the buyer what property to buy. That's their decision. And if they like someone else's house more than yours, that's not our fault. Don't sue us. The lawsuit in question, the actual plaintiff lost, but because of that situation, I think her name was Victoria. She was an attorney that worked with Coldwell Banker. She was on the board with CAR and ZIP forms, back then it was WinForms, and put together this disclosure, and it's been in use ever since. And it's a good one. It's a good secondary reminder of the agency relationships and dual agency also. So this will come as part of every package, and that's that. We talk about wire fraud. There's been a lot of that. Basically, this is a warning telling people, if you get some strange email telling us, to wire your funds to XYZ, make sure it's actually the title company or the bank or whatever that you're working with, because a lot of fraudsters will send these things out when they see the property goes pending, and they figure if they do, 10 out of 100, maybe somebody might bite and they'll get some money wired to their account, which is probably in Russia or something. So. All right, then we get to the actual purchase agreement. Starting right off the bat, it's going to be dated the date that you completed it and the date that your client signs it. You're going to have their full name. They could be purchasing as a trust or an entity, in which case there's a separate form that will go along with this. If you use that form, you can still have the actual sign orders sign it, but you're going to want to list the name of the entity up here. Let's see.
So cool, quick question.
Yeah.
I have a client that's in a trust on her house, so I would put on, this is an offer from, I would put, such and such trust on her name.
That's that's the ideal way to do it. The question is, if you're buying as a trust, you put the name of the trust on the top line. Ideally, that's the way you'd want to do it. However, if it's a finance buyer, sometimes the lender is going to have a problem with you actually purchasing it in the name of the trust. So what you would have to do is you purchase it in the name of the individuals, and then after the deed goes on record, they can simply deed out personally and into their trust. Same when you refinance a property that you have in a trust. Oftentimes, the lender will require you to deed out back to yourselves temporarily. Good, if you refinance it, once the refinance is complete, then you can deed it right back into the trust.
Okay, so have you ever seen a lender being okay with the trust name?
Not a lender, but if it's a person paying cash, yeah, it'd be fine. All right, certain things you really want to include in here, or it's not a contract. You have to have who's making the offer. You have to have a full property address, and this is, as you'll remember from your real estate classes, statute of frauds. Statute of frauds says that certain contracts must be in writing. There's one of those contracts, or any property for the sale of land or real estate, if it's a purchase or if it's a lease for more than a year, it has to be in writing. If it's a contract like a prenup, a contract involving marriage, it has to be in writing, and there's some other requirements for that. And there's like 4 or 5 others. If it's a contract for the sale of goods over $500, has to be in writing. Most people think that contracts have to be in writing in general, but that's not the case. Many of them can be oral. This is not one. So you have to have sufficient terms to make a contract. Those terms require the person making the offer, property address, so you can identify the subject of the contract. It has to be dated, there has to be an amount, and there has to be consideration. In this case, the consideration would be covered by the earnest money deposit. So once you have all those items here, and I would highly suggest, actually I would, more than I'm certain, you really want to try to put the assessor's parcel number, because oftentimes addresses get confused. There are many circumstances, and I know of one right now, where the property located at the end of the street, if you look at the tax records, it's got the tax parcel, if you look at Google Maps, it would show you an address of the house that's right next to it. So there can be confusion on property address. Parcel numbers in the tax records are usually correct. So I would recommend you always put the full property address and the parcel number. I took a class recently with Dave Tanner, who's the CEO of the Sacramento Association of Realtors, and I learned something there that I had not known before. But while you always want to include the county, in this case, Sacramento County, what Dave said is, if it is in an unincorporated city, so say for example, North Highlands, you don't actually have to put anything in here if it's in Sacramento County and an unincorporated city, because this is specifying a city. North Highlands, you will not find a city named North Highlands. There's an area known as North Highlands, but it's not a city. So if you left this blank for a North Highlands purchase offer, that would not destroy the validity of this contract. It doesn't hurt to put it in really, but if you missed it, it wouldn't matter. Coming down, we once again disclosed agency, which is great. And when they redesigned this form a couple months ago, as you'll see down here, they made it much, much more clear cut in the way you fill it out. It looks kind of overwhelming if you're not used to this format yet, but in the long run, I think you'll find it helpful. So here, you're going to say who the seller's brokerage firm is. That, if that's in this case ABC Realty, you'll put the name of the seller's agent, Wilbur the Horse. You want to use the brokerage's license number here and the agent's license number here. If ABC Realty were the brokerage on both the buy and the sell, listing and buying side, you would put both instead of checking the seller's agent, you would check both the buyer and seller's agent as dual agents. Same thing down on the buyer's brokerage firm, same type of thing here. Let's see. They added in that there are potentially competing buyers and sellers. Once again, making it easier for us to cover our butts because there's a possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. Disclosure of consent, that was the previous document that you saw. Terms and purchases, this is where the meat of the whole contract is entered in. So you can see here, you're going to put the purchase price. If it's all cash, you simply put an X here and you don't need to worry about the financing stuff. Close of escrow. I would highly encourage you, if you're representing a buyer and you're writing up this contract, depending on the financing type, there could be varying ranges that it's going to take to get that deal closed. If you're using down payment assistance through, say, SAC housing and redevelopment, that time scale might be quite a bit longer than it would be if you're just doing a straight FHA loan with, your favorite lender. So talk to your agent and get confirmation from them how long they're going to need to close this, and that will be how you determine what to put in here. I've always preferred myself, rather than putting a specific date, unless of course I have a client that's buying and they're saying moving out of an apartment, they have to be out of the apartment on a certain date, have to be closed escrow on their new house by a certain date. In a case like that, I might put a specific date. But generally, I try to put something, whether it's 30 days or 45 days, or in a competitive market, we might talk to the lender, or if it's cash buyer, we might be able to move up the closing. It just depends on the market circumstances at that time and what your lender says. But find out from your lender, and if the lender says 45 days, this is where you put it. And just note, I put a little notation over here, for expiration of that date, day one of that count starts the day after the contract is ratified. So if today we get a contract, we submit an offer to so-and-so, and the seller responds the same day and accepts it, and it's dated today on the acceptance, then tomorrow starts day one of that 45-day count. Just note, if the 45 days ends on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday, it would automatically roll over to the next day. Expiration of offer. These contracts default to 3 calendar days after all buyers sign. So if they, and it's calendar days, not work days. They're very specific on this. So if the buyer signs it today, at 5 p.m. on day one, today's Friday, day one would be Saturday, day 2 would be Sunday, day 3 would be Monday. So Monday at 5 p.m., this offer expires. Now, I will tell you that many agents, most agents, I would actually say, have probably always gone along with the concept that, well, if I submit an offer, and even if it's already expired, as long as the seller comes back with an acceptance, we can revive the offer. Well, that's the way business has been done in real estate for many years, and a lot of agents will do that. But just know that if you're smart, when a seller accepts an offer after the expiration, that offer was actually dead. And so the only way that you would have a binding contract is if the buyer then initials as accepted and puts the date and sends it back over to the seller. If the seller really accepted after the expiration, there's not a binding contract, because of the many ways that a contract or that an offer can die. It can be rescinded by the person who made the offer prior to acceptance. It can be, and I'm not talking about the normal ways that a buyer can cancel after the contract is ratified. Party to it can die. The person that made the offer can die. before it's accepted, be rescinded, it can expire, it can be withdrawn. I mean, there's just a whole myriad of ways, and this is one of them. Once that expiration date hits, technically the seller could no longer accept. So, just as a corrective action, if you do get an acceptance after it expires, just shoot a copy of the contract back over to the other side, and where the buyer initial, have the seller sign an initial, date it, and send it back over, just to have all your P's and Q's dotted.
So you're saying, I send in an offer, it's dated today, expires tomorrow. The next day, after tomorrow, they get back with me saying they accept it, and the way to confirm that it's good is to have the seller sign on here.
No, the seller will sign it as accepted, have the buyer just initially.
Double sign, okay,
Double sign it and send it back over.
like an additional
Yeah,
signature on the side.
because essentially what's happening is when the seller sends that late response back to you, essentially they are making a new offer to you. And it's up to the buyer to accept that offer.
Right, so just double sign, add it on there on top of that.
Yep.
All the initials.
Just something to clarify that you in fact both agree to it.
Right.
And once that's done, you're good as gold. Let's see, initial deposit amount. Let's see, hold on. Got kicked out of the meeting, now I need to let back in. All right, let me go check that. All right, you guys should be back in now. All right. Initial deposit amount, EMD earnest money. Typically, if you're representing a buyer, you're gonna try to get 1%, a minimum of 1%. You will see some deals in the Bay Area where it's gonna be a lot more than 1%. I remember, back when I worked in the Bay Area, you might see earnest money deposits, and this is before the property values shot up into the millions, at least in the markets I worked, where it was common listing agents and their sellers wanted $50,000 EMDs and things like that. I've never seen anything like that here in the Sacramento area. Typically though, you want at least 1%. And the reason is, if the buyer breaches the contract and does not close, and they did not have a contingency that they could rely on to back out of the contract, the seller is able to retain their earnest money deposit up to 3% of the purchase price. The courts have said if you go above 3%, they're not going to be able to retain that. So,
Quick question on that.
Yeah.
Is it up to 3%, or the earnest money deposit amount, whichever is less?
up to 3%, whichever is less. If 3% were, $100,000 and you accepted, or I'm sorry, 3% were $15,000, but they did a $5,000 earnest money deposit, the liquidated damages that the seller could claim would be $5,000. Okay. And one word of caution here. It used to be that it was common practice for the buyer's agent to have the buyer write them a check payable to, XYZ title company or title company. And if the offer was accepted, the buyer's agent would then get that check over to the title company. Most brokerages, and us included, we do not want you to collect physical checks from the buyer. If you collect a physical check, that check needs to be brought to the office, logged into a check registry, and maintained in that registry until it's time to go to the title company. And it has to be signed in, it has to be signed out of, who it's going to be released to, so on and so forth. It's an actual audit point for the Department of Real Estate. So the best way to do this is to buyer gets an accepted offer, you have the seller, I'm sorry, once the buyer gets an accepted offer, you have the buyer either deliver the money to the title company or have the money wired to the title company as an earnest money deposit. That way it never passes through our hands. Increased deposit, I'm just gonna touch on this lightly. I don't see it used a lot, but just know, sometimes you will have a seller counter and they'll say, you know what, we want you to increase your earnest money deposit, and I'll give you an amount that would bring it up to 3%. Just know that if you do that, they're also going to want to use this form DID because the form DID specifically and expressly states that that increase in earnest money deposit is now also part of the liquidated damages in the event the buyer defaults. Without that DID form, the increased deposit would not be able to be, the seller could not apply that money to the liquidated damages clause, and they would have no claim on it. This new revision of the contract made this very clear, so agents won't avoid doing it, which is great if you're on the listing side, because you're not gonna make that mistake that could potentially cost your client some money. On the buyer side, it makes it more clear to your client that if they put that increased deposit in there, it is subject to liquidated damages if they default. Now here is where you put in the meat of your offer. And I put a few things in here just to kind of show you where they go. But in an offer for $500,000, and let's just say this was an FHA financed buyer who was getting CalHAPA down payment assistance. FHA, you got to put down basically 96.5%, or you got to put down 3.5%. You can get 96.5% financing on the FHA 203B loans. In this particular case, I also checked over here, they're getting CalHAPA financing. So in the event that there is other financing, you want to fill out this next section, and you would fill that information in here so that it's fully disclosed to the seller. What you don't want to do is, let me back up, I'm sorry. If you're doing conventional financing, you just fill out this section right here. You don't need to worry about, yeah. So if you're doing FHA, VA, or any type of seller financing for down payment assistance or whatever, special loan programs, you're going to fill in this box here. If it's just conventional, all you need to do is this section here. And it's really important that you follow the lead in this section right here. So you're going to put the amount of the loan. It will calculate the percentage of the purchase price automatically. If it's a fixed rate, you don't need to put anything here. If it's or initial adjustable rate not to exceed, you can have an amount put in here. If the buyer is paying no points, you don't need to put anything here. If the buyer has to pay something, you want to put it in here. But you want to put in the not to exceed an amount, because that can be another way of your client being able to get out of the deal if the rates do jump up dramatically and they're kind of stuck, in this loan. If they can't get a loan for less than this amount here, they have a way of backing out. Because as you know, especially right now in April of 2022, interest rates are changing dramatically week by week. We have people that were loan qualified last week that now are no longer qualified to purchase at that price. So it can have a major impact on the buyer's financing and the ability to buy. Again, I talked earlier about talking to the loan agent and getting some details. Whether it's conventional, FHA, or VA, doesn't matter. You want to have a conversation with your loan officer and see what's going on in their business. Because a loan officer will tell you, there's no way, I can give, get this thing funded or appraised and underwritten and, ready to close in anything less than 21 days. Well, this defaults to 17 days. So, you want to determine what you put here by what's going on in the market and what your lender is going through in terms of his backup. I dealt with lenders before who were having trouble getting appraisals done in less than 3 weeks because of the craziness of the market at the time. So what he did is he took a portion of his loan fee and gave a bonus to appraisers or to the appraisal management company that would then pass on to the appraisers to put their appraisals at the head of the line. So it just depends on who you're working with and what the timetable is like. You're going to use section E2 if there's additional secondary financing like CalHAPA or something like that. Occupancy type. So it's going to default to owner occupancy or primary. But if it's an investment property, you want to check here. Full disclosure to the seller when they're looking at this deal. Now, I put a little note here. The amount that defaults here should be the same as what you have up above in the contract as the purchase price. But if you've done this right, the initial deposit amount, the EMD, plus the increased deposit, if you have any, plus the loan amount, plus the balance of down payment should total this. And you can run the numbers real quickly by just adding them all up.
Quick question. So if you look at the loan amount, 482, that's only subtracting the 3.5% down payment, but not the earnest money deposit.
Right. I didn't fill in all the additional financing for the CalHAPA for this example.
But is that okay though to not subtract the earnest money deposit from the 500,000 when you're writing the loan amount first? The first loan amount.
Well, this form actually does all the calculations. So if I were to have put the down payment assistance in here, it would have changed all the numbers. So going on to the next section, if additional finance terms, and I put a note here, if the buyer is using down payment assistance, also note that here. If there's a seller credit, you can put it over here. When it talks about verification of all cash, verification of down payment and closing costs, verification of loan application, I would go with the defaults on this. Normally, this type of stuff can be referenced in your lender's pre-approval letter. Now, if it's verification of all cash, oftentimes what we've done, and this was really huge, or this was really common when we had a lot of bank-owned properties, because the bank asset managers, they wanted to see proof of funds to close. And that's the common terminology you would use. But normally we would say, look, get us a copy of your most recent bank statement. You can black out your account number, but we need the bank statement to see that you have the funds necessary to close if it's a cash buyer. One other note to think about on the area above where you're talking about financing and loans. Oftentimes, you'll deal with a buyer who's using hard money financing, and there's a lot of those buyers who are under the mistaken belief that if it's hard money, it's the same as cash. Don't buy into that. A hard money lender, they may commit to lending, and they'll send you a commitment letter, or they'll give your client a commitment letter that you can present to the seller that says, oh yeah, we've committed a line of credit, of X hundreds of thousands to, John Smith, and you're expected to give that to the seller along with this offer. It's not a cash offer. At best, it's a pre-qual or something along those lines, because most hard money lenders, they're still going to go out, they're going to try to get an appraisal of the property, they're going to do all this other stuff. The cash buyer, if cash is good as gold. But if it's a hard money lender, there are strings that can be attached to it, and I would encourage you to consider that a financed offer when you're presenting that to the seller. Okay, contingencies. This is really where you get down to it in this contract, and this is what will protect your buyer throughout the process. You just got to get the dates right and live up to what you're supposed to do. So loan contingency, you can go with the defaults, which all the defaults here are usually 17 days. Depending on the market, that may be reasonable, maybe not. If you're in heavy competition for a property, you've got a great lender working with you and your client, you might be able to do inspections on the property in 5 days. So you can release, or within 5 days, so that you can release the contingencies for the inspection, assuming there aren't any major problems within 5 days. You would do this if you're trying to make the offer more attractive, but it has to be reasonable of what you can actually accomplish. Worst thing to do is, say that you're going to do this, this, and this, and then not be able to follow through and have a listing agent or seller's agent sending you a notice to perform because you're in breach and maybe eventually canceling the contract on you. So be realistic when you go from anything other than the defaults here. Again, appraisal contingency is based upon appraisal value at the minimum purchase price of X. Well, if you're an FHA buyer, you want to fill this in, but there's also a VA FHA amendatory clause form that would be attached here, and that basically says, regardless of what you have in a contract, if the property doesn't appraise for the amount of the purchase price, the buyer doesn't have to buy. You can't penalize the buyer for it. That's because you're dealing with the federal government, Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the Veteran VA Loan Guarantee Program. If there's no appraisal contingency, so like if you're going to do, if you have a cash buyer, they don't care what your appraisal is at, you can check this. There's no loan contingency. They're already pre-approved. You're in a competitive market. You talk to their lender, and has communicated with the buyer, and you've all communicated together, and the buyer, the lender, and everyone is certain that there's not going to be a problem getting this loan. You can go with no loan contingency, but your mantra has to be, removal or waiver at the time of the offer is against the agent's advice. So you just got to explain to them there is a risk. If the lender all of a sudden changed their underwriting guidelines or something like that midstream, you could get screwed. You always want to warn them on the side of safety. Investigation of property. This is kind of a broad form. It goes hand in hand with review of seller documents and review of the preliminary title report, review of the HOA documents, all of that stuff. That is your client doing inspections they want to do, reviewing those inspections, reviewing the TDS and the SPQ, the transfer disclosure statement, and the supplemental property disclosure or questionnaire, and any other third-party disclosures they might have made, reviewing the natural hazard disclosure report, the prelim, the HOA documents, all that stuff, coming out and saying, yes, I want to go forward, or no, I want to cancel. That's the investigation of the property and all this stuff here.
Quick question.
Yeah.
If we remove the inspection contingency with the contingency removal form, and just but we don't remove the disclosure review, but we remove the investigation part, would we need to write 0 on the investigation of property? Right, 0 days?
No. If you're saying you're going into it and you're not going to have any investigation of property at all?
Well, you still want to review the seller docs,
Yes.
but you don't want to do
You're not going to
inspections.
do a home inspection? Yeah, you would put 0 days.
But they can still back out based off the disclosures though? Within
They
5
can
days?
still back off based on disclosures, financing, condition of title, feng shui. I mean, as long as they have a good faith reason to some aspect of their inspection or review rights, they can back out. It's, there's a common misconception though, that during that 17-day period, buyer can back out for any reason. That is not quite accurate. You have to have a good faith reason for backing out. And good faith is a really vague term, but it could be something as simple as, you know, after we got under contract, you know, my wife, who, you know, one of the buyers, she had a horrible dream about the property. She's very superstitious, and we decided to cancel. That is a good faith basis for cancellation. It is just as valid as if something in a home inspection was a big red flag for them, or you know, they discovered that in review of the HOA documents, that the HOA doesn't allow cars to be parked on the street overnight. And they didn't know that. That is a good faith basis for canceling the sale. So it doesn't have to be concrete, it just has to be done in good faith. And along with that, I know there are a lot of agents that will tell their clients, you know, let's just get it under contract. We can cancel, you know, for anything, you know, once we're under contract. Well, you know, that may be true as long as it's a good faith, you know, basis. But you don't want to also be in a position of having to manufacture a reason for canceling. You know, just be honest about it. You know, when you write this offer, that's a bit of work. Getting it, processing it, getting it to the seller, that's also a bit of work. And this, on the seller side, on the listing agent side, you're putting them through a lot of work. And you want to make sure you're not just doing it willy-nilly and putting multiple offers out on multiple properties without telling these listing agents what you're doing. Because then you also get into code of ethics violations for failure to communicate. So, you know, just be honest. If you're putting offers on two different properties, just let those agents know. And it's cool to tell them, look, my client really liked this one more, but they're kind of pressed for time, so we put one on this one too. We're hoping to get this one, and we will go through the sale if we get it. You know, just try to be honest with both of them. Let's see here.
So they have 17 days.
They have 17
to
days.
back out based off of disclosures.
Yeah, or a shorter amount. Now, let me talk for a second about these days and how these contingencies are removed. It used to be in the old days, the contract that we used up until I think it was October of 2002. When you hit 17 days after the contract ratification date, the contingencies automatically dropped off. You didn't have to have your client sign a document saying, I'm removing this contingency. It happened automatically on day 17 or day 21 or whatever day it was. The problem was a lot of real estate agents weren't keeping an eye on those dates, and it was costing their clients money in the form of lost earnest money deposits because the client decided they didn't want to go through with the sale, and that contingency had been removed automatically. In 2002, this November, December, Windforms, as it was known then, redesigned the contract and made all of these specific contingencies that the buyer had to remove. If the buyer doesn't remove them, they continue going down the calendar. Now, if you're on top of your deal, you want to try to, you know, as long as everything's looking right, you're not going to have a problem with condition, your inspections came back great, you don't have any issues with it, there's nothing wrong. In fact, it's preferred that you get the client to remove those contingencies when, you know, by the date they're supposed to be removed. If you fail to do that, then the seller side can send you a notice to perform, which will give you a specific period of time by which, if you don't remove that contingency, or those contingencies, depending on which ones they are, then the seller can, what I term unilaterally, meaning without the buyer's permission, the seller can cancel on you. At that point, the seller can't keep the deposit, but they can get out of the contract with you and avoid wasting any more marketing days and get the property back on the market.
Oh, so they couldn't even take the deposit either in that case?
No, and to touch on your point, the only way that the seller actually has a legal claim on the buyer's deposit is if there are no contingencies left over that the buyer can back out of the sale and use. Once all the buyer's contingencies are removed, that's when that deposit is kind of locked in. And if the buyer then breaches by failing to close escrow, the seller can demand that the title company release the deposit to them.
Wow. I was always curious about that because when I'm communicating to my buyers, when they could lose their deposit, technically, even if they remove their inspection contingency, but they go to day 17 and want to back out, they still wouldn't lose their earnest money deposit because they had the disclosures missing on there.
As long as they have not removed those disclosures, yes.
Let's say they signed them off though, but they still have appraisal and loan contingencies. But then they're like, let's back out.
Well, appraisal and loan contingency, those are valid contingencies. So as long as they have not removed those, they can still back out of the contract and get the deposit back.
Would they be legally required to give proof that the appraisal contingency could be approved or the loan could be approved?
If those are the only ones that you have left, yes. And absent the lender sending some kind of a document saying, I'm sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Smith could not qualify for the loan, or that, I'm sorry, the property did not appraise for the purchase price, then your client's deposit would be in jeopardy.
Okay, so you do have to have proof.
You have to have a good faith reason. Yeah. Mostly where you get into this, it's on investigation of property in terms of inspection issues. And so I'm going to touch on this for a second too, because this is relevant. If you do your inspection and you find a bunch of issues that are concerning to the buyer, health and safety issues, there's a crack, a crack on the side of the house that could be foundational issues, whatever it might be. Let's just say your client plans that for whatever these issues are, they want to write a request for repair to the seller. And you're still within your 17 days, but let's just say you're on day 15 and you send this request for repair over to the seller. And the seller's contemplating it and they're getting their own bids and doing this and that and the other. The clock is still running. Your client has not yet removed their inspection contingency. What you have to remember is that just because you send over a request for repairs, that doesn't mean that you're excused from the 17 days in the investigation of property contingency. The seller, if they wanted to be a jerk about it, could still theoretically, even though you sent a request for repairs, they can send you a notice to perform. Additionally, the seller, if you send over a request for repairs, they don't even have to respond to it. You can send it over, they just ignore you, they wait until you hit the 17 days, they send a notice to perform, and wait for that period that's referenced in the notice to perform, and then send you cancellation. They could also, while they're considering that request for repairs, let's just say you ask them to fix X, Y, and Z. They might say, well, they can reply to the request for repairs. We're not going to fix X, Y, and Z, but in return for you waiving and removing the inspection contingency, we will credit $5,000 to the buyer at close of escrow. Oh, did we get I think the sound is off. Let me check that real quick. Can you guys hear me? Hello, can you hear me? Somebody tell me if you're hearing me, or if, the sound is still off. Okay. All right, perfect. Let me get back here. All right, still good. So, let's see where I left off. Oh yeah, submit a request for repairs. Seller isn't obligated to accept it. I tell my clients, if they ask what happens when the buyer side submits a request for repair, I say, look, there's a couple options you have. You can either say, yep, absolutely, I'll comply. You can say, screw you, nope, I'm not gonna do any of the work. Or you can come to an agreement and say, well, I'll do A, B, and C, but I'm not gonna do D, E, and F. And lastly, you can say, rather than do any of it, I will offer you a credit at close that you can use for your recurring and non-recurring closing costs. And I will tell you that if you're on the seller's side of the transaction and you get an offer and there's an issue, you go under contract and there's an issue with the request for repairs. If you're representing the seller, ideally the best way for you to handle a request for repairs, if the seller is not going to just totally say, no, I'm not going to do anything, then rather than do any of the work, the best alternative is to offer a cash credit at close. And the reason is, let's just say that the issue involves dry rot and rotted wood, fungus, and that sort of thing from a pest inspection. Well, the problem is, you agree to have that work done as the seller. Once they start digging into the walls and removing things, they might find a lot more damage. And then your seller is going to end up having to deal with a lot more. It's going to be a lot more costly than they thought it would be when they agreed to do these repairs. So if you're on the seller side, ideally you want to push for a credit. If you're on the buyer side, if it's not something major that there could be a lot of hidden damage, credits are fine. But by the same token, if you're going to get a credit and it's something like pest work or replacement of an HVAC system or something like that, you just want to make sure that you hedge your bet and you get enough to know that you're going to be able to cover any hidden damages. So it's two different ways to look at it. Let's see here. Review of liened or leased items. So I spoke about this a little bit in the listing agreement class. You want to make sure right off the bat, if you're dealing with an FHA or a VA buyer, if there is solar that was installed on the house, or a new HVAC system, new windows, anything like that that the seller has financed, you want to make sure they didn't finance it with a PACE loan. Because if there's a PACE loan, that will have priority over an FHA or VA finance loan for your buyer. And what will happen is you're going to go through all this trouble of, buyer's going to pay for an appraisal, home inspections, whatever, and they're going to find out that the lender can't do the deal because on title it's a PACE loan that's going to have priority over their first lien, effectively making them a second. The only way you can do something, complete a purchase with FHA or VA, is if the PACE loan is agreed to in the contract to be paid off by the seller at close of escrow. So that would be an important contracting note that you want to think about when you're devising your offer. Preliminary title. Preliminary title reports are important because oftentimes the seller doesn't know that somebody filed, a lien against their property. Maybe who knows, maybe it's a mechanics lien or whatever. All of those things have to be paid off prior to the close of escrow. Otherwise, the buyer's lender won't lend on it. If there's a cloud on title, let's just say one situation we heard about recently involved a life estate. If whoever holds title, holds title with somebody else that owns a life estate to the property, they can't pass your buyer clearance and merchantable title. But you may not know that, they may not even know it until the preliminary title report is issued showing what is of record. HOA documents are huge because they will tell you the bylaws of the association, if there's an association involved. They'll tell you what you can't do, where you can park, where you can't park. I personally, I live in the Thomas Park, and we are not allowed to park on our streets, at least overnight. We're not supposed to park on them at all. We can't leave our trash cans out more than, the day of garbage collection. And they actually have people walking around the streets reporting you if you mess up. If we want to paint our house, we have to have permission from the landscaping commission, I think, or committee. Even if we're going to use the same colors that we already have. So some people really like HOAs, some people really hate them. It just depends on your client, but they're not going to know your clients aren't going to know what the rules are until they get those documents. Those documents must be provided by the seller. That's in the civil code. The key though is if the seller doesn't get those documents until the end of your inspection review period, from the day that you get those documents, your client would have an additional 5 days that goes beyond the inspection period deadline in order to review them. So that's a good lesson for you if you're listing a property. You want to talk to your seller about ordering the HOA documents, and usually that can be done through your favorite title company. You want to order those in advance so that once you go under escrow, you can get those documents over to the buyer at the same time as you get all the rest of your disclosures, and there are no delays.
Good question, sorry.
Yeah.
So basically what you're saying is, let's say we're in day 17 of escrow and, they receive the HOA docs, I'm sorry, let me rephrase the question. Let's say they get the HOA docs on day 1 and the seller wants them to sign them immediately. If they were to sign them within 5 days or whatever, would that contingency is basically removed?
No. So the question was, if you get the HOA documents on day 1, the seller signs them, received and reviewed, does that remove the contingency?
No, the buyer signs it.
The buyer signs it. That does not remove the contingency. There's a difference between when the buyer provides them to you, when you acknowledge that you received them, and when you actually sign a document formally removing the contingency.
Same as with the disclosures?
Same with disclosures, exactly. Okay. And you may, if you use a TC, your TC may send that stuff over as your client gets it and reviews it and signs it. Doesn't mean you remove the contingencies, which is why you would have your TC probably hounding you at day 17 saying, hey, look, we got all this stuff, you need to sign the contingency report.
Right.
Let's see. Sale of buyer's property. You're not going to see too many of those transactions right now because it's really a seller's market, and it's unlikely that a seller would take what's known as a contingent offer. A contingent offer is contingent on the buyer finding a buyer for their home so that they have the money to complete the purchase of this seller's home. But if you do run into that situation, check that little box here. It will add the form COP to this contract, and then it becomes part of the contract. And basically, the buyer is not fully committed until their home, and depending on what you put in the COP form, they're not fully committed until either the property is in escrow or some other deadline has passed or been met. There's also within that form COP a box that can be checked, which would say, in the event that the seller of this property receives any other offer that they are interested in accepting while this buyer is in contract, they can give this buyer a notice that, hey, I'm giving you the right of first refusal. You can either remove your contingency and continue with the sale, or if you don't remove this contingency by such and such date, I am free as the seller of this house to accept this other offer that I've got. So there's a couple ways that you can work it with the sale, the contingency for the sale of the buyer's property. Time of possession, I normally go with upon notice of recordation. You'll find that depending on, especially if it's a financed offer, title companies receive lenders' wires for the funds that the buyers need to close escrow at various times in the day, or at least in the morning up until mid-afternoon. Sometimes those wires make it at a time when it's too late to release the deed to record that day. So the title companies will schedule it for a morning recordation, which means, by 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning, you get confirmation that it's on record. Other times, you might not hear until, 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So I've always gone with the default myself, and I just go with upon notice of recordation. That's the point when the buyer's agent can then give the keys to the buyer. You never, ever, ever, without written permission from the listing agent, you never, ever want to give the keys to the buyer ahead of time out of the lockbox. That's a no-no, and that will get you an ethics violation and probably a substantial fine. And when you open a super lockbox, there is electronic evidence that you did open it to. So just tell the buyer they have to be patient. You will meet them out there as soon as we get confirmation of recording.
It is okay for them to move in early though, if the listing agent sends an email saying
It is
possession is okay, or?
No, it is not okay to move in early unless you get an early occupancy addendum. Okay? That's gotta be in writing, it's gotta be signed by the seller. Okay? And I would highly recommend you not help facilitate that. So the question was, is it okay for a buyer to move in early, if you have some communication with the other side? It is not okay without an early occupancy addendum being signed by the seller. But even with that said, things happen at the last moment. I've had numerous experiences over the years with the day escrow was supposed to close, something happened and it could not close, and it never could close. Typically, it's, something will happen like, so a lender prior to funding, oftentimes they will do a final employment check on the buyer, on a borrower, or they'll do an updated credit report. Well, if your buyer client was planning on they work from home and they need Comcast installed the day after they move in, so they contacted Comcast a week before they closed escrow, and they ordered their cable system put in. And in order to do that, Comcast runs your credit. Well, if they run your credit and you have a borderline credit score for the loan program you're in, you may not be able to get a loan if they rerun your credit again. So, all sorts of stuff can happen. So, if your seller client is actually considering a request by the buyer side to have early occupancy, you want to be sure that you caution the seller, well, things happen. If this happened, you might have somebody living in your home that doesn't own it, may not ever be able to own it, and then you have the whole issue of trying to get them out if they decide they don't want to. So that's a conversation you want to have with them. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Let's see. Seller occupied or vacant unit. I want to touch on this for a second because it is very relevant to what we're seeing happen today. As you know, when the COVID pandemic started, there was a lot of problems with people working from home, losing their jobs, so on and so forth. There have actually been situations where sellers who contractually received a rent back after the close of escrow for 30 days, and you may or may not have heard about these on the news, the sellers refused to leave, and they fell back on, it's a pandemic, I can't work, I have nowhere to move to, and for sellers who are now basically squatters still in the house, and the new owner has not been able to get them out because of the eviction moratoriums that have been in place. So, you wanna think about, occupancy, after the sale and things like that. It is not necessarily a bad thing to allow a seller, to continue to occupy the home after the close. And you can use this as a guideline here. And I was glad to see that with this revision of the contract, they made a very clear distinction between 29 or fewer days and 30 or more days. The reason they did that, if you do a seller in possession form and keep the period of time to 29 days or less, what your buyer is granting that seller is what's known as a license to be there. Contrast that with a time period that goes 30 days or more. In that case, what you've given the seller is a lease, essentially. It's a short-term lease, but it is a lease. The difference is, under the law, a license doesn't require an eviction. Police can remove the person. A lease requires that the buyer, now owner, would have to go to court and have them evicted. And there's a that's a much more expensive proposition. You're looking at anywhere from, starting at probably $750 to $850 to do an eviction. And it's gonna take time, especially right now, where, evictions are just now starting to be allowed under certain circumstances. So, again, if there's gonna be a rent back, try to keep it 29 days or fewer and use the SIP form, seller in possession. Tenant occupied properties. You want to make sure if you're representing the buyer, you use if it's a tenant occupied property, and it should be noted expressly in the MLS listing. You want to use this TOPA form. Part of that also on a tenant occupied property. You want to have heavy communication with the listing agent to find out if you're an investor, you may want the tenant to stay, but if you're going to be an owner occupant, you want to find out, well, when was the tenant given notice? Is the tenant moving? And when is the tenant moving? And so on and so forth. There's going to be a lot that you want to communicate with the listing side to coordinate when the tenant's out, when the buyers can move in.
Quick question, I literally was looking at a listing today, that one of my clients might be interested in, and the tenant, there was tenants in the property, and it said in the remarks, due to tenant schedule, viewing cannot take place before offer acceptance, so it said make offer contingent upon inspection.
Yeah.
How does that work? Like, do they have the ability to come view the property, faster if they have an offering in, accepted?
So, if you didn't hear the question, essentially he said, we saw a listing in the MLS today, and it said, property is tenant occupied, you can't visit the property before you make the offer, make your offer subject to buyer's inspection. That is a common thing that you'll see on tenant occupied property. Personally, my recommendation, if you're a listing agent, it's a nightmare to try to market a property with a tenant in it. I've tried it several times. The only thing I can think of worse than marketing a tenant occupied property is marketing a property for a couple getting a divorce. I've never had a smooth transaction on a tenant occupied property. You have issues that range from not being able to get anything but the crappiest of marketing photos because they will try to make it as messy as possible in order to delay the sale of the property. They'll raise issues of not being available to allow people to see it, even at very reasonable times. It's just one issue after the other. So in my particular case, my preference is I've always encouraged the property owners to get the property vacated before they put it on the market. That solves another problem too. You can get the property cleaned up. If there's damage to it, you can get the damage corrected if the market at that time would warrant doing that. It just makes the whole transaction a lot smoother. That said, if you are showing a property that is tenant occupied, you want to be respectful of the tenant. Don't, try to avoid any kind of encounters with them, that are negative. Don't make comments about the house, while you're in there with the tenants. Oftentimes, you'll see a blurb in the MLS saying, make offer subject to inspection, and that's exactly what it means. You make an offer, you get under contract, during the inspection period, you can do what you need to do, get into it, take a look. That might very well mean that you don't order an appraisal, you don't order a pass, you don't do anything that's gonna cost you money until you get in there the first time with your agent and are able to look around. And then based on what you see, you may very well be canceling after that first visit. Or you may say, okay, we'll proceed with our inspection. You work with the listing agent to coordinate with the tenants so that you can have a period of time that you need to get your inspectors in there and do their thing. And hopefully the tenants will cooperate, because sometimes they won't. So again, just one of the problems when you're dealing with tenant occupied properties.
How quickly, if the tenants, assuming they're
Speak up.
sorry, how quickly, once you get into contract, can you legally be able to come and walk into the property, assuming the tenants cooperate?
Okay, so most residential rental agreements or lease agreements usually have a clause in there that says that the owner or property management company with reasonable notice of 24 hours can come into the property. So usually the owner, if they're going to be problematic, the owner can enforce it on that. Sometimes they have to actually follow the letter of the law and post a notice on the front door saying, I'm coming out to your property on such and such date. And they would coordinate with, you and your client or their property, the listing agent to go out, to be able to go out there and get in that way. Like I said, tenant occupied properties are a problem.
If they refuse, you have to do the process of eviction.
Well, if they refuse to let you get in to do your inspection, I would say you probably don't want to go through with the sale.
Right.
Um,
As a seller, though, you really want to get rid of the property, but the tenants are not cooperating, what do? You
Well-
just go through the process of eviction?
Well, then you have to determine if you have good cause to evict. That might involve having to get a lawyer. It's happened. We have a property management company. My business partner and I have a separate property management company. And we've had those tenants before that just say, sorry, you can't come in. And, then at that point, you talk with the property owner and you find out if they want to make a business decision, since they're still paying their rent, to allow them to stay there, or you want to spend the money and evict them and get somebody else. As far as the last 2 years, landlords, property management companies haven't had a lot of options there because of the moratorium.
It's terrible.
Yeah. Welcome to property management. Let's see here. It gives times to pay fees for HOA documents that are on the seller. Your escrow company, once you open escrow, is going to send you provisions and instructions. Those are kind of their general rules of escrow and what they will do and what they expect. You need to sign them. Buyers and sellers both need to sign them. This here, you want this done, install smoke detectors. You want the seller, you want to ensure, talk to the listing agent, make sure the seller double check on this. It's installed smoke detectors, CO detectors, and embrace the water heater. And you want that done right away, because if your buyer is getting an appraisal, finance deal, they have to get an appraisal, or the home inspector is going out there. Just on the appraisal side of it, an appraiser goes out and spots that it's missing a CO detector, or it's missing a smoke detector, or they're inoperable, or something like that. The appraiser won't sign off on the appraisal in order for the loan to be underwritten and financed. And what the appraisers do is they use that as an income source, because they will require that they be allowed to go back out to the property again to ensure that that is done. So if that happens, I think there's a provision in the contract now that the seller actually has to absorb that cost. However, you just nip it in the bud right up front by making sure you kind of reach out to the listing agent and just ensure that all the smoke detectors are in place, CO detectors in place, and the water is extract. That way, there's no issues that come up with the appraiser that they're going to have to go out again. Let's see here. This here, go through and just check the boxes of the appliances that are there. It used to be the old contract, if it was a freestanding stove, you always wanted to check the box that the stove was included. That's because if it's a freestanding stove, it's technically personal property and the seller can take it with them. Now, you're just going to check the appliances that are there and whether they're freestanding, connected or not. You know, you wouldn't check the refrigerator unless they're telling you that the refrigerator is included, obviously. But you know, any of this stuff, if you see it there and it's noted as included in the sale, make sure you check the boxes there. If there's a freestanding spa in the backyard, even if it references that it's included in the MLS, you want to put it in the contract. Remember, the MLS is not a binding contract between the buyer and seller. It's a statement of marketing, basically. And it's binding in terms of the commission that's paid to the buyer's agent from the listing agent's total commission that they listed it for. But it is not binding on the buyer for things that they may include in their marketing that they say are included, like the freestanding spa that's sitting in the backyard. So if you want that, if the client wants it, you should include it. Allocation of costs. This is where it says who's paying for what. The first one here, you see natural hazard zone disclosure report. This is a big one because this is the majority of the statutory disclosures that the seller has to make. You will find that if you use one of the disclosure companies, you know, there's Disclosure Source, there's Property ID. There's several of them out there. They run the gamut in prices between probably $49 and $99, and they cover all of the statutory disclosures, such as, you know, is the property in a high fire severity zone? Is it within X miles of a military ordnance storage zone? Is it in an earthquake zone, a flood zone? Are there old mines underneath the property? You know, anything like that is a statutory disclosure that California says the seller must disclose will be included in that report. Keller Williams has their own disclosure company that you're welcome to use. If you use that one because there's an ownership interest with Keller Williams, you also want to make sure you include an affiliated business disclosure saying that they're related companies. If you use any of the other ones, that's not going to be required. So that covers that. You want to put that the seller is paying for that. And the reason is, legally in California, the seller is required to make these disclosures. They're not required to pay for the report, but they're required to make those disclosures. They could do those disclosures independent of a report. However, if they use one of these third-party reports, they have a safe harbor to rely on in the event any of the information is incorrect. So, and that's why, for liability purposes, I always encourage agents to use one of the pre-printed reports that you can get and the seller will pay for it. And then it talks about who's responsible for smoke alarms, all that stuff. There's two boxes, Q5 and Q6 on here. They deal with government point of sale inspections and reports and government required point of sale corrective remedial action. Most of the areas around here don't have any of those that you have to worry about. But if you are in doubt, for example, in Woodland, in Yolo County, if the home is equipped with fire sprinklers, which most of the newer homes are, you have to have the fire department come out and conduct a test. So you want to say who's going to pay for those. That's where you would use
have stuff like that too?
I think Davis does too.
So you have to check off seller.
Yeah, unless you want there to be a question of who has to pay for it, and you want the sides battling back and forth.
Right.
It's better to have it in writing ahead of time, that way you don't have to worry about it. Escrow fees, I put here what's customary for, say, Sac County. Escrow fees 50/50, seller pays for the owner's title policy. Typically, the buyer's gonna pay for an ALTA policy, that's American Land Title Association. And that protects only the lender that's lending you the money. County transfer taxes, typically the seller will pay those. City transfer taxes, either both will pay it, or sometimes, depending on the market, we're gonna allocate that to the seller. You notice here HOA fee for preparing the disclosures. Seller is the default. HOA search fee, that would be the buyer if that's required. And HOA transfer fees. In this case, I put it to the seller. Depending on what's customary in the area, it might be the buyer. That's those. Private transfer fees. I circled that. I kind of made a little squiggly line to draw that to your attention. So several years ago, probably in the mid-2000s, there were some areas of Rockland and Roseville that the builders wanted to develop, and some naturist companies like Sierra Club basically sued to prevent these builders from doing their developments. And I want to say it was like Fitment and some of the other ones out there. Anyway, that lawsuit would have delayed their construction for many years. So the Sierra Club came to an agreement with these builders, and I believe a trust was established. And what the trust said was, under the initial sale from the developer to the first buyer, there's no private transfer fee. But every subsequent sale after that, there's a private transfer fee that will apply. And that money that's collected in the private transfer fee gets allocated to the Sierra Club or whoever's managing this public trust. So if you don't know whether or not there is a private transfer fee that's applicable, if you're dealing in a property in Roseville or Rockland and it's a fairly newer neighborhood, you probably want to allocate, if you're on the buy side, you probably want to allocate the seller. You would leave it blank, but the seller would take care of it. If you know you got a lot of competition and you're one of many offers being submitted, you're trying to sweeten up your offer, well, maybe then you offer the buyer will pay it. That's going to make a difference. You think your buyer getting the deal or not. But anyway, that's what a private transfer fee is. Home warranties. I am a huge proponent. If you're representing a buyer, you want them to get a home warranty. I don't care if the seller's paying for it, the buyer's paying for it, or in my case, maybe me paying for it. But a home warranty plan that comes with the house will, I can't tell you how many lawsuits that those things will prevent. The worst thing that happens is the buyer closes an escrow, they didn't have a home warranty, and immediately upon moving in, they try to use the built-in in-house vacuum cleaner that's tanks in the garage, and they have the little outlets throughout the house that they move the hose around. And all of a sudden, they discover that the vacuum doesn't work, and it's missing, missing one of the boards and it gets fried or whatever. Their immediate thought is, well, the seller knew it didn't work, they didn't disclose it, and now they're ticked off and they're going to go after everybody. And those things aren't cheap. So you have a home warranty, that may take care of it. I myself, first house I ever bought was a townhouse in Pacifica, California. I purchased a home warranty. I knew better because I was in the business. I purchased a home warranty, and 3 months after I moved into that place, the furnace went out. It was with Fidelity at the time, and Fidelity actually replaced my furnace. I paid at that time, I think it was a $50 service charge. So these things really do pay out. I've had clients over the last year who bought within the last year, and I've had some clients file multiple claims, and They do work, they're not a scam or anything like that, and they will help, they will save you, and you'll have your client's appreciation for it. Here, other addendum, if you're gonna include an addendum with the offer, you'll check this box, make sure you call the addendum number 1, 2, 3, whatever it is. And you wanna make sure you associate it at the top of the addendum form with the residential purchase offer dated such and such date, so that they know that that addendum attaches to that.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So I was potentially gonna write an offer on this property that stated the seller wanted a 28-day rent back. The loan officer for the client told me, well, you know, we want either a long escrow of 45 days and a short, rent back, or it's still, I mean, the lender's not gonna like it, we can't do it. So I was suggested by someone to put on a separate addendum, that there would be a rent back for the seller of 28 days, and to not mention the rent back on the offer. Now, if I were to do an addendum to the offer, I would have to check that box right there, right?
You would.
And then the lender's gonna ask for the addendum.
Well, okay, so there's 2 ways. Now, I'm gonna elaborate a little further on what you asked in a second. If you are doing the addendum and submitting it with your purchase offer, you check the box here. If you are doing an addendum after you have a ratified contract, you can still do it. It wouldn't be checked here. And as long as the seller is willing to agree to it, the buyer is willing to agree to it, that addendum would be legally binding. The problem, so you can do it that way. The larger problem I see with what you said is you never want to be in a situation where you are in cahoots with a lender trying to conceal something from the underwriter or whoever that loan is going to be packaged to be sold to. Because if you do that, basically it's loan fraud. And actually I got a compliance question recently, last few days. There was a situation where the buyers on a deal, we were representing the buyers. Buyers wrote a request for repairs. The seller responded back, you know, I won't do the repairs, but I'll credit you X at closing. And that was the deal. It's going through the whole process. And when the loan officer sees that, the loan officer says, no, can you please redo this and just do a separate addendum saying, you know, the seller is granting a credit at close for X. Well, the reason the lender is doing that is they're trying to conceal this information for whoever's going to be getting, you know, doing that loan.
For the underwriting,
Yeah, and that's loan fraud. That's a federal crime. So you never want to be involved in that. You know, if they're going to do stuff like that, then they have to figure out a way. As I told this agent, you know, this is what they're trying to do. They resolved it in a different way anyway, but you just got to be careful with getting into that kind of stuff. Because if there's emails going back and forth and you're in that loop, whether you intended to be involved and whether you are involved in it at all, you're still going to be involved in it.
right?
Let's see, important one here. We have a lot of rural property around here. You know, you go to Rio Linda, Alberta, you know, the area around Davis, Yolo County, where you have septic systems, you have well systems, propane tanks, things like that. If the property is one of those types of property, you want to check this, and you want to get the form SWPI. You're going to spell out within that form who's going to pay for the septic inspection, who's going to pay for the well test. It's going to spell out whether the propane tank is owned or leased, you know, all that good stuff that's important for your client to know. And in cases where there is a septic tank or a well, you definitely, regardless of who's paying for it, you want to have the septic system inspected and pumped. You want to have the well, both the volume of water and the quality of the water checked, because those are the things that can usually go wrong with that. Let's see here. on septic systems, the form will actually also disclose who is responsible for uncovering the lids to the tanks. Oftentimes you go out to those properties and the homeowner who's lived there for years decided they're tired of having to, dig into their yard every time they have to do this. So they put risers on the septic system and they have nice caps on top. Other times, the septic companies you have to go through the expense where they drop a electronic or radioactive capsule through the toilet, and they track it from the outside to find out where the septic tank is. And they got to bring a backhoe and scoop out the soil in order to get to the lids in order to do the pumping and inspection. That's very expensive. I think I paid up to $1,200 to have to go through that. So, those are things to think about. It's kind of an innocuous little box there, but if you got a well in the septic system, you better include this form. Got all the fair housing forms, statewide buyer and seller will be included. Increased deposit, I already talked to you about if there's an increased deposit involved, you have to actually specifically say the money is covered by the liquidated damages clause. If there's an all-cash offer, I put a little note here, remember, hard money is not all cash. This is important too. When you submit this, your buyer is authorizing the seller and the listing agent to contact the buyer's lender to determine the status of the buyer's loan, so on and so forth. There's also a note here under FHA-VA that if it is an FHA-VA loan, that there's going to be an FHA-VA amendatory clause that's incorporated into and agreed to by the parties. And if there's any lender requirements for requests for repair, that would be a condition of underwriting. Those have to be given to the seller. And it also says here, and this is important, let's see here. There's a clause, it's elsewhere in the contract, I guess, but it basically says that even though the buyer may agree to pay more than the appraised price if it doesn't appraise, that clause, if you insert it into the contract, is void on its face if it's an FHA or VA loan. You cannot contract out of the requirement that the buyer not be required to pay more than the appraised for. So just know that. Lastly here, if you make an offer for a property and you indicate you're going to use conventional financing, don't then later change it to an FHA finance deal and fail to get clearance from the seller via an addendum to do that. Financing is a material term of the contract, and you can't just unilaterally change it because your lender says, oh, gee, made a mistake, can't do conventional, but we can go FHA. That's something that involves a need to communicate with the listing agent and the seller, and it has to be done via an addendum. To do otherwise, it's going to be breach of contract. It's also going to potentially put you in jeopardy of an ethics complaint. So, also, if, let's just say you did have what we talked about earlier, where you submitted a request for repairs to the seller, and the seller, rather than doing the repairs, agreed to offer you a credit for recurring and non-recurring closing costs. Make sure you also involve your lender in that discussion when you talk about an amount, because sometimes, depending on the buyer's ratios and the lender's guidelines and all sorts of stuff that you have no involvement in, there might be a cap on the amount of any seller credit that could be used. So even though the seller might be willing to credit $15,000 for recurring and non-recurring closing costs, which is great for your buyer in the process of getting their loan might only be able to use $10,000 of it. So just touch base with your lender.
I'm curious so
Yeah.
let's say we were to find
Yeah.
let's say we were to find mild damage via the inspections, and we wanted to request a repair request, or let's say we wanted to request a credit, for $50,000 or something, right? And, would we only have to state to the loan officer that we're requesting a credit, and that's it? And that's the only communication we need with the loan officer, is requesting our credit?
Oh, no, you gotta have discussion. You would communicate everything, the amount, everything else. The reason being, the lender is going to see that when they review the final settlement statement that the title company prepares. So it's gonna be fully disclosed in writing, but you wanna make sure that your client is actually gonna be able to utilize that full credit. Because your client's gonna be pissed if he agrees to waive the repair request in return for the seller giving $15,000, then he finds out at the last minute when he's in there doing his signing, that the lender's only gonna allow him to get $10,000 back credit.
Well, I guess my question is, does the lender need to see that we even requested a repair before the credit was even a discussion?
I personally would not do it at that point. Well, I might call up the lender and say, hey, look, we got a couple of, issues that came up in the home inspection. We want to, the seller has offered to credit back X. Is that amount going to be a problem? And, because by then you would have submitted your request for repairs. The seller has come back with a response saying, we'll give you this. Before the buyer signs it, you have a conversation with the lender and say, is this going to be a problem? And you deal with it that way.
Okay.
But once it's done, yes, the lender should get a copy of that.
Okay. I didn't know if maybe the lender would be like, well, can I see all the inspections if I mention that?
They might, it depends on the lender, and if that's the case, then you have to. I mean, I had a deal a few years ago where the lenders were requiring, this lender was requiring that I submit a copy of my agent visual inspection disclosure to them.
Huh.
Yeah, I'd never been asked for that before. They asked for it, I gave it to them.
And they're kind of at the mercy of them, I guess.
Yeah, because, you want the deal to go through, and it's not, there's no confidentiality issue. They're putting their money out for this, to loan on this house.
Right.
Let's see. It talks about, written verification of buyer down payment, closing costs within the time specified, may be made by buyers or buyer's lender or loan broker. Oftentimes your pre-approval letter that you get from the lender is actually already going to state within the body of that the lender has already verified that you have these assets, that they run your credit, and all this other good stuff. Sometimes you might need to get the lender to contact the listing agent. I will tell you, we often, on a buyer, when we're representing a buyer, my experience is it's really, really helpful to have your lender, you send the offer over to the listing agent, you list the lender's contact information, you give the lender a heads up that the listing agent might be contacting them, and then even after you've done that, you have the lender send an email over to the listing agent saying, these people are gold, so-and-so has been working for the state for 15 years, I have full confidence, they are completely underwritten, approved, I can close this thing in X number of days. That helps a lot when it's a seller and they're reviewing offers and they're trying to figure out which is the one they should go with. So, take advantage, if you're representing the buyer, take advantage of your lender and partner up with them, and they can really, really help you get that house under contract. Closing and possession, that just refers back to the time period we specified earlier. Condition of property and closing. The important thing here is the property is going to be delivered as is in its present condition as of the date of acceptance. The only exception to that is if the seller has agreed to do repairs, those have to be done prior to the close of escrow unless there's some other agreement that's made. And the house doesn't have to be spotless, but it has to be at least broom swept, and they have to remove their garbage. The thing to understand here is if the seller has not cleaned it or removed all the debris out, that does not give you a reason to not close legally. Buyer would still have to close even if there's debris still left in the house. Buyer couldn't say, well, screw you, I'm not gonna let my title company release the deed and record until this stuff's been taken care of. Seller could actually say you're in breach. So buyer would have to close. What happens then is the buyer has a remedy. They can take the person to, small claims court if they don't do it. They'll take care of their cleaning bill or, things like that. They couldn't refuse to close escrow. Seller remaining in possession after the close, that's only if it's been contractually agreed. And we talked about those forms earlier. At the close of escrow, if there are warranties, owned alarm systems, things like that, the sellers remain to give the passcodes and all that stuff to the buyer. Removal of contingencies, they have to be removed by the date specified, and basically, if it's not done, then the seller can issue a notice to perform. There's one note here on an appraisal contingency. Removal of the loan contingency is not deemed to be removal of the appraisal contingency. So even if your buyer removes the loan contingency, the property still has to appraise, and then the buyer still has to expressly remove the appraisal contingency. Let's see. We already talked about investigation of the property. So what's happening in this part of this new contract is all of these headers are referring back to that grid that you filled back in the beginning. And this is specifying what the detail of what it means and referring back to that section. Okay. If there's a revised preliminary title report that's issued once you've already gotten the initial one and it's getting close to close of escrow, if something turns up on that and it's a material issue, then that would also give the buyer a right to cancel, depending on what it was. Talks about the requirement for the seller to provide condominium plan unit development disclosures. If the property was built before 1978, the seller has to provide a lead paint disclosure. That's really important. The one big change that is done to the whole lead paint issue in recent years is if there is lead paint that's an issue, the seller can't just hire a Joe contractor to come out and remediate the lead paint. It has to be done by professionals that are certified in lead paint. So, and that's important, especially if your client has small children. For any contingency specified in the contract, the buyer shall, within the applicable period specified, remove the contingency or cancel. Those are the options. Like I said earlier, even if you're waiting on a response for a request for repairs, sorry about that. My phone was ringing in my hearing aids. Even if your client has submitted a request for repairs to the seller and you're waiting on a response, the seller can still demand that you remove the contingency. The request for repairs is a entirely separate issue and it's irrelevant. The problem for the buyer is once you remove the contingencies, the seller doesn't have to honor any request for repairs. So you're faced with being in a position of, well, gee, if I delay until I get the response, the seller can cancel, issue a request for repairs and cancel. On the other hand, if I remove the contingency to comply with the contract, they don't have to do it. And you just have to be able to explain those options to your client and get guidance from your client as to how they want to proceed. If it's a significant repair issue, I would hold off and risk the seller canceling. If it's a market where that you know that the seller had 7 offers on the property and they can jump right back into a backup offer, well, then your buyer might want to weigh that risk and decide if they're going to forget about the repairs and just remove the contingency forward, or they're going to hold to their guns and risk being canceled. leased or lien item or systems, typically things like solar systems, leased alarm systems, things like that. Seller has to disclose that information to you, and then, if necessary, they either have to return it, pay it off, or have to accept a sign of it. Or your, I should say, your client has to accept a sign of it. Goes into, again, referring back to the initial time period, inspection reports and certificate, government requirements, point of sale requirements. Sometimes in some areas there are point of sale requirements, as we discussed, like in Woodland, where you have to have the sprinkler system inspected by the fire department. There's a fee for that. This is where under reinspection fees, it talks about if any repair in paragraph 10B is not completed within the time specified and the lender requires an additional inspection to be made, seller can be responsible for any corresponding inspection fee. If buyer incurs costs to comply with lender requirements concerning those items, seller shall be responsible for those costs. This was never in the old contract, so it's nice that they put this in there. Talks about the value of home warranties.
Oh, quick question.
Yeah.
So I'm actually in an escrow right now where we requested repair of the stove burner that didn't work, and it was an outlet that wasn't grounded or something that the appraiser found. Seller accepts the repair request, gets their, the listing agent gets their guys over there to do the repair. But the listing agent told me, well, the buyer's gonna have to pay for an inspection. Does this, protect the buyer and state that the seller would have to pay for the reinspection by the appraiser in this case?
If the seller, so the seller agreed to take care of the stuff, the seller agreed to take care of the stuff, and they said it was done, and then the appraiser went back out, it wasn't done, and it's gonna now charge the buyer another $100 to go out again, yes, this would protect the buyer.
Okay, only if it's that third time, basically. They
Well-
come out for the appraisal, they come out for reinspection, and the third time will be seller's requirement?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I haven't come across that, so it's kind of unknown territory, but yeah, probably.
Cool.
I've got about 4 minutes left before I'm gonna get booted out of here. I'm gonna touch on the more important ones. And actually, I think there's too much more stuff to cover on this. So I think I'm going to stop here for today at the end of page 7. And we will pick this up as a part 2 at a later class. That way I'm not gonna have to rush through stuff in 3 minutes and you're not gonna miss anything important. I apologize for that. This is the first time I've given this class with this new form here. And my timing, I couldn't quite estimate it just right. But I hope you'll join me again when we announce the part 2 of this course. So, if there are any quick questions, I might be able to answer them. If you want to put them up on the screen, I've got a couple minutes left. Okay. All right, I want to thank you then. If you do have any constructive criticism, I would love to hear it. Please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll see you at the next one. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Chris.